Welcome to Vigorous Performance Enhancing Drugs. I'm Coach Steve. In this video, I want to discuss my experience with Nebivolol, which technically isn't a PED, but it does have some performance enhancing benefits and properties. So let's go over all of it and why I decided to incorporate it into my PED protocol. Nebivolol is a beta blocker, which is generally prescribed in cases of heart failure or to control high blood pressure. It selectively blocks the beta-1 adrenergic receptor, but unlike all the other beta blockers, it actually activates the beta-3 adrenergic receptor. So in that sense, Nebivolol is very similar to a selective estrogen receptor modulator, acting as an estrogen in certain tissue and as an anti-estrogen in other tissues. And you could say the same for a selective androgen receptor modulator, although SARMs mostly act as an anabolic agent, but don't really have catabolic or anti-androgenic properties in certain tissues. So in that sense, Nebivolol is a lot more selective than SARMs are, because Nebivolol blocks the beta-1 receptor, but it activates the beta-3 receptor. Nebivolol only blocks the beta-2 receptors at higher dosages, which doesn't really happen on a conservative dose of 5 milligrams per day, which is the general recommended dose that's prescribed in cases of heart failure or high blood pressure. It's the same dose that I'm using. I've been using 5 milligrams of Nebivolol per day for the last couple of months. So in that sense, I don't notice any blocking of the beta-2 receptors, but I do notice an activation of the beta-3 receptors, which is where most of the performance-enhancing properties of Nebivolol come from. So let's go over that first. I think that's the most interesting aspect of this compound, because blocking the beta-1 receptor mostly results in a reduced heart rate. The beta-3 adrenergic receptors are found in the vascular system, adipose tissue, and the bladder. Now, in a conservative dose of 5 milligrams Nebivolol per day, you don't notice any incontinence, which would be horrible. But if you're a little bit older and you already have incontinence, it's probably not a suitable beta blocker to take. And it would be better to look at other beta blockers, which don't stimulate the beta-3 adrenergic receptors. When Nebivolol stimulates the beta-3 receptors in adipose tissue, you get a little bit of lipolysis. Now, this effect is not as pronounced as clenbuterol by stimulating the beta-2 receptors, which is where most of the lipolysis come from. But the fat loss of Nebivolol is quite noticeable when you're in a caloric deficit and you do a significant amount of cardio or activity to stimulate the burning of body fat. Now, it's definitely not as pronounced as clenbuterol, because of course clenbuterol actually stimulates the heart to beat faster, which is where part of the fat loss comes from. You have an elevated heart rate at rest, which helps to burn a significant amount of body fat because the heart works predominantly on fatty acids. So the way clenbuterol works, it stimulates the beta-2 receptors on adipose tissue, causing lipolysis and fat loss, but it also stimulates the beta-2 receptors on the heart, increasing heart rate, which will then burn the body fat at rest. And that's where the metabolism increase of clenbuterol comes from. Now, Nebivolol works a little bit in the opposite, because it stimulates the beta-3 receptors, causing lipolysis, but it reduces heart rate, so it balances itself out. So if you think that Nebivolol is a suitable fat burner, you're mistaken. So even though Nebivolol increases lipolysis, the overall fat loss is much less pronounced compared to clenbuterol, because Nebivolol also reduces your heart rate, which then lowers metabolism a little bit and the requirement to burn free-form fatty acids. Now, you can easily compensate for this by lowering caloric intake or increasing your cardio output by increasing your heart rate, or, which isn't really advised, but some people still do that, a combination of Nebivolol and clenbuterol, because Nebivolol works by blocking the beta-1 receptor and activating the beta-3 receptor, and clenbuterol works by activating the beta-3 receptor. So now you get the fat loss of the beta-2 and the beta-3, but the heart rate doesn't increase so much because Nebivolol is blocking the beta-1 receptor on a milligram dose, and clenbuterol is activating the beta-2 receptor on a microgram dose. Anyway, I don't really recommend this, because now all these receptor pathways are competing with each other, and it's similar to taking agmatine sulfate together with yohimbine and ribosine, or taking testosterone together with aldactone, which leads to opposing signals and just makes everything more complicated. Now, the beta-3 receptors are also found in the vascular system, and there it helps to release nitric oxide into the blood, contributing to blood pressure management. Now, when I added in Nebivolol, I noticed a significant amount of blood pressure reduction, so I reduced my Cialis dose from 10 milligrams to 5 milligrams per day, because it causes a similar effect. It increases nitric oxide content of the blood, which helps to relax and dilate the blood vessels. So now I'm on 2 self-prescribed blood pressure medications, 5 milligrams of Nebivolol and 5 milligrams of Cialis, which act pretty similarly, and they help to keep my blood pressure perfect, even during those heavy leg workouts, which is the only point usually where my blood pressure would increase a little bit. But during any other point of the day, my blood pressure hovers around 120 to 125 over 60 to 65 with a heart rate, let's say at rest, 50 beats per minute, 55 if I'm walking around a little bit. But during cardio, I noticed the most amount of heart rate reduction because normally I would bring up my intensity to 120 to 130 beats per minute. But now I'm hovering around 90 beats per minute for the same amount of activity. So I had to increase my intensity a little bit to bring up my heart rate to that fat burning zone again, now that I'm in a caloric deficit and trying to burn some body fat. So now that I'm coming off steroids and I'm preparing for PCT, I'll probably take the Cialis out at one point when I notice that my diastolic blood pressure drops below 60, because I don't need so much blood pressure management combining Nebivolol and Cialis. But I prefer to stay in Nebivolol because it reduces my heart rate a little bit. And in that sense, I feel a lot calmer, but I also feel more focused. And it could be because the fatty acids and the ketones are now preserved for my brain. Whereas before, my heart would burn most of these free-form fatty acids. And now they're being readily used by the brain in combination with ketones, which increases my cognition, my focus, and overall state of well-being. So that's a huge plus for me. And that's the reason why I prefer to stay in Nebivolol over Cialis for blood pressure management. Another beneficial effect of Nebivolol, by stimulating the beta-3 adrenergic receptors, is that it reduces appetite a little bit. So by reducing your heart rate, probably reduce metabolism as well, and reducing your appetite, I have zero cravings, which is absolutely great when you're in a caloric deficit. So I don't feel like cheating on my diet. I don't feel like having something sweet when I do have a cheat meal in the weekend. So the ice cream is out. I didn't notice much of an appetite reduction during the off season when I was already eating 5,500 calories per day. But usually when you eat that much, you don't really feel hungry and food becomes kind of like a job. Now the appetite reduction you would normally get during the off season when you're in a chronic caloric surplus, it doesn't compound with the appetite reduction of Nebivolol. So in that sense, I could still eat, but the thought of food, especially eating something sweet that's not on the diet, was completely off the table. And now that I'm on about 3,000 calories per day, the thought of food still doesn't enter my mind. I have absolutely zero cravings. So in that sense, Nebivolol is probably the best appetite suppressant I've ever tried. And when you compare that to stimulatory appetite suppressants like ephedrine, clenbuterol, phentermine, sibutramine, melanotan 2, it makes you nauseous, a little bit of an appetite suppressant. So you don't get any of the side effects that are associated with those stimulatory or nauseating appetite suppressants. You only get benefits by a little bit of fat loss, appetite suppression, and a reduced heart rate. So let's go over why I added in Nebivolol in the first place. Now, normally I follow a ketogenic diet, and whether that's during the off season or a cutting phase, I do a ketogenic diet with a one-day refeed in the weekend. So let's say 500 to 700 grams of carbohydrates over the day coming from rice, quinoa, or bread. And then on top of that, I would have a cheat meal for lunch and dinner, which is a lot of food volume and a large amount of calories. And what I noticed during the day is that my heart rate would just pick up, especially after lunch, because it has, I already had a decent amount of carbohydrates in my system. And then lunch would have, some saturated fat or some polyunsaturated fat because it is a cheat meal and you don't get to choose or control how much fat it contains. So as soon as I had a decent amount of carbohydrates in my system, by adding in the fat, my heart rate would pick up and it would be a little bit uncomfortable. I would have a resting heart rate of like 100 to 110 beats per minute, just sitting there watching TV. And then I would start sweating, and in Thailand, it's hot already. So you're sweating just sitting there and it's annoying. So I decided to add in a beta blocker to reduce my heart rate and reduce the requirement of cheat food and carbohydrates, because now I would preserve these calories to actually be stored as intramuscular glycogen stores or intramuscular triglyceride stores, right? And resulting in fullness and giving you a lot of energy for the week to come during a ketogenic diet, whether that's during the off season or a cutting phase. And during a cutting phase, I would even eat more, so maybe 700 to 1,000 grams of carbs with a cheat meal on top. And then during the off season, I would eat a little bit less because I would have more fat during the week, which preserves a little bit of glycogen, of course. So I wouldn't need to refeed so hard on a Sunday during the off season, but during a cutting phase, I would refeed and cheat pretty hard, and my heart rate would be a little bit uncomfortable. So initially, I only added in 5 milligrams of Nebivolol on Sunday because it would reduce the requirement of food that I would need to eat just to fill out for one day and replenish my glycogen stores for another week of training. So I went from 700 carbs and quite abusive cheat meals to 400, 500 grams of carbs and a little bit cleaner cheat meals without all the, extra garbage on the side. So by reducing my heart rate and preserving calories, I was able to fill out on a lot less food, and that really brought in my waist, because normally on Sunday I would be completely stuffed by the end of the day and basically go to bed as a seal or a beached whale. So now my stomach doesn't protrude anymore at the end of the day, even though I ate a significant amount of calories. And when I noticed that my stomach was a lot more streamlined and a lot tighter during the week, I decided to add in Nebivolol when I was bulking on a large amount of carbohydrates. Because again, I would preserve these calories for my muscles and training output instead of wasting them away by increasing my heart rate unnecessarily. So even though Nebivolol is a beta blocker, and you would assume a reduced power output during the workouts or any athletic performance, just like all the other beta blockers out there, with Nebivolol it's not the case, and it's probably the most well-studied beta blocker amongst athletes, proven that power output isn't reduced and athletic performance doesn't decline. And whether that's by moderately stimulating the beta-3 receptor or by selectively blocking the beta-1 over the beta-2 receptor, I'm not really sure about that effect. And I can vouch for this, including the clients that chose to add Nebivolol to their protocol. It doesn't reduce training capacity or workout intensity whatsoever, and it might actually increase it when you're during the off-season, because it reduces your heart rate in between working sets a little bit faster, which results in the preservation of calories, which you can utilize during your next working set. And this is where most of the performance-enhancing benefits come from. It shortens the rest duration between working sets because you're preserving calories, bringing your heart rate down a little bit faster. And when you compare that to clenbuterol, for example, which keeps your heart rate elevated throughout the entire workout, the required rest duration in between working sets on clenbuterol is quite high because it takes so long for your heart rate to come down just before you can do another working set. But with Nebivolol, it's relatively fast. So you can expect like a rest duration between working sets of 30 seconds. So what I did is I did my working set, I unload the weight, I load up the next machine, and I would do another working set because I would be ready to roll. And that's where some of the performance enhancing benefits of Nebivolol come from. You can just go through your workout faster, shortening the duration between hypertrophy stimulus, which results in, you guessed it, more muscle mass. And that's why Nebivolol is a performance-enhancing drug. I hope you found this discussion about Nebivolol to be helpful and informative regarding your own bodybuilding or fitness journey. If you did, please leave me a like. If you're not subscribed now would be a good time to do so. And share it with your friends so they can learn something about Nebivolol as well. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.